By the spring of 1944, the invasion of Western Europe was no longer a question of ambition or capacity. It was a question of location. Somewhere along the French coast, one decision would narrow the war into a single, irreversible direction. This channel examines World War II through the moments where certainty hardened, assumptions failed, and decisions closed off alternatives. If you're new here, consider subscribing. Now, let's begin. By late 1943, the Allied invasion of Western Europe had become an accepted certainty on both sides of the Channel. The question was no longer whether an invasion would come, but where it would land, and under what assumptions it would succeed. From the German perspective, the answer appeared self-evident. Geography dictated it. Doctrine reinforced it. Intelligence reporting supported it. The Pas de Calais, the narrowest point between Britain and France, stood as the most logical crossing point for any force attempting to return to the continent. It offered the shortest sea passage, the most direct route to Germany's industrial heartland, and the strongest existing port infrastructure. Every analytical model pointed there. German planners had reached this conclusion years earlier. Even before the United States entered the war, German military studies consistently identified Calais as the most dangerous point along the Atlantic Wall. By 1942, defensive planning increasingly treated Normandy as a secondary concern, a region too distant, too exposed, and too logistically awkward to support a decisive Allied landing. By early 1944, this assumption had hardened into operational doctrine. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, viewed Calais as the natural Schwerpunkt of any invasion. Owen Rommel, tasked with inspecting and strengthening coastal defenses, agreed. While Rommel differed from Rundstedt on how best to repel a landing, arguing for immediate, forward defense rather than mobile reserves, he did not disagree on where the main blow would fall. German intelligence reinforced this belief. Signals intercepts, aerial reconnaissance, and agent reports consistently suggested Allied preparations in southeastern England. The density of landing craft in ports facing Calais appeared overwhelming. Rail traffic patterns seemed to confirm it. Even Allied deception, once detected in fragments, appeared to point in the same direction. The more the Germans looked, the more Calais confirmed itself. This was not carelessness. It was coherence. The Pas de Calais fit German expectations because it aligned with how modern armies were supposed to behave. Shorter supply lines reduced risk. Faster crossings limited exposure. Direct routes simplified command and control. Every operational lesson of 20th century warfare pointed toward efficiency, compression, and speed. Calais satisfied all three. By January 1944, German planners had converted this belief into concrete deployments. The 15th Army, Germany's strongest formation in the West, was positioned opposite Calais. Heavy coastal artillery covered the straits. Panzer divisions were held back nearby, prepared to counterattack once the invasion beaches revealed themselves. Normandy, by contrast, was garrisoned more thinly, treated as a potential diversion rather than the decisive front. The logic appeared airtight. On the Allied side, however, certainty took a different form. In London, the invasion was being shaped not by geography alone, but by an accumulation of hard constraints. By late 1943, Allied planners understood that success would depend less on surprise than on sustainability. The invasion would not be won on the beaches. It would be won in the days and weeks that followed, when men, vehicles, fuel, and ammunition had to flow continuously across the Channel under fire. This was not theoretical. The failure at Dieppe in August 1942 had made the lesson unavoidable. A narrow front, insufficient ports, and compressed forces invited destruction. Even a temporary foothold meant little if it could not be expanded, reinforced, and supplied. The assumption driving Allied planning was therefore not where can we land fastest, but where can we keep landing. That distinction mattered. By November 1943, the Allied combined chiefs of staff had agreed that the invasion must involve multiple beaches, spread across a broad front, with room to maneuver inland. The landing would require not only infantry divisions, but space to absorb losses, space to reorganize, space to build momentum before German reserves could respond. Calais, for all its convenience, imposed limits. Its narrow frontage compressed forces into predictable corridors. Its proximity to Germany ensured rapid enemy reinforcement. Its defenses were the strongest on the coast precisely because everyone expected them to be. Normandy, by contrast, appeared imperfect. The beaches were farther from England. The tidal conditions were complex. The region lacked major ports. German defenses were weaker, but not absent. The terrain beyond the beaches, hedgerows, sunken lanes, small villages, offered no immediate breakout. On paper, Normandy looked inefficient. But inefficiency had a strategic advantage. It introduced uncertainty. By December 1943, Allied planning documents increasingly reflected this shift. The invasion, now formally designated Operation Overlord, would rely on breadth rather than speed. Multiple beachheads would dilute German response. Artificial harbors would offset the lack of ports. Air superiority would isolate the battlefield, slowing German movement inland. This plan did not promise elegance. It promised endurance. At the center of this process stood Dwight D. Eisenhower, appointed Supreme Allied Commander in December 1943. His role was not to design the invasion from scratch, but to reconcile competing doctrines, national priorities, and personalities into a single executable plan. Eisenhower inherited a structure already under strain. British planners favored caution, shaped by years of war and hard-earned survival. American planners pushed for mass and momentum, confident in industrial capacity and numerical superiority. Naval commanders worried about tides and sea states. Air commanders argued for delays until air supremacy was absolute. No proposal advanced without resistance. No assumption went unchallenged. Within this environment, one voice pressed more insistently than any other. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, appointed commander of all Allied ground forces for the invasion, reviewed the existing Overlord plan in January 1944 and found it insufficient. According to staff records, Montgomery believed the original landing front was too narrow, the initial force too small, and the risk of containment too high. He did not argue for Calais. He argued against compression. Montgomery pushed for additional divisions on D-Day, more beaches, and a broader initial lodgement area. He insisted that anything less invited a repeat of Dieppe on a continental scale. His proposals increased complexity, strained logistics, and demanded greater coordination, but they also reduced the chance of immediate failure. Not everyone agreed. Some American commanders viewed Montgomery's revisions as overly cautious. Others saw them as an attempt to reshape the operation in Britain's image. Tensions surfaced in meetings. Memoranda grew longer. Maps were redrawn repeatedly. Eisenhower listened. According to later accounts, he allowed the arguments to run their course. He read the critiques. He reviewed the numbers. He asked what would happen if the Germans reacted faster than expected. He asked what would happen if weather delayed reinforcement. He asked what margin of error the plan allowed. Gradually the options narrowed. Calais, once the obvious answer, now appeared rigid. Normandy, once the awkward alternative, appeared adaptable. The choice was no longer between efficiency and risk. It was between compression and flexibility. By February 1944, the plan had effectively settled. Normandy would be the landing site. 5 beaches would be assaulted. Airborne divisions would drop inland. Artificial harbors would be constructed. The invasion would accept complexity in exchange for survival. The decision did not feel dramatic at the time. There was no single meeting where Calais was rejected with finality. Instead, it faded from the conversation, crowded out by requirements it could no longer satisfy. The model had shifted. By early spring, German certainty remained fixed on Calais. Allied certainty had moved elsewhere. 2 systems, operating on different assumptions, were now locked on diverging conclusions. One of them would soon be tested. The calendar was closing. The weather would decide the rest. By early 1944, the invasion plan had hardened into something that looked complete on paper. Beaches were named. Divisions were assigned. Timetables were drafted down to the hour. Yet beneath that appearance of resolution, the plan remained vulnerable to one unresolved tension: who truly owned it? Dwight D. Eisenhower's authority was absolute in theory and constrained in practice. As Supreme Allied Commander, he was responsible for every outcome the invasion produced. But the plan itself had emerged from months of negotiation among British and American staffs, each shaped by different experiences of the war. Eisenhower did not arrive to impose a vision. He arrived to arbitrate among competing certainties. This distinction mattered. The Allied command structure in early 1944 was deliberately collaborative. Naval, air, and ground commanders retained strong institutional identities. British officers carried the memory of Dunkirk, Crete, and Dieppe. American officers brought confidence derived from industrial scale and distance from European catastrophe. Each perspective claimed realism. Each produced its own logic. Eisenhower's role was to decide without simplifying. According to staff minutes from January 1944, Eisenhower resisted early pressure to finalize details prematurely. He allowed disagreements to remain unresolved longer than many found comfortable. Maps were left open. Briefings ran long. Revisions were requested and returned without comment. This was not indecision. It was method. Eisenhower understood that once the plan became fixed, responsibility would become singular. Until that moment, disagreement served a purpose. It revealed hidden assumptions and exposed fragile logic. The moment of closure had to come late enough that no one could later claim they had not been heard. Bernard Montgomery used this environment to apply pressure. Montgomery's position was unusual. He did not command the invasion politically, and he did not control the final decision. But he controlled the ground war that would follow the landings. His authority derived not from hierarchy, but from consequence. If the invasion stalled inland, it would stall under his command. In January and February 1944, Montgomery repeatedly returned to the same critique: the initial plan underestimated German resilience. According to post-war British records, he believed Allied planners were still assuming a faster German collapse than evidence supported. German formations in France, though uneven, had not shown signs of systemic breakdown. Panzer divisions, once committed, would fight. Montgomery's insistence was procedural, not rhetorical. He asked for additional divisions on D-Day. He argued for a wider front to absorb counterattacks. He questioned whether a narrow lodgment could survive even 48 hours under pressure. His proposals complicated everything. More troops meant more landing craft. More beaches meant more naval coordination. A wider front increased the burden on airborne forces. Each adjustment rippled outward, stressing timetables that had already been pushed to their limits. Some American officers saw this as unnecessary caution. According to later memoirs, they believed speed and aggression would compensate for initial risk. A rapid breakout, they argued, would render early compression irrelevant. Montgomery did not debate tone. He debated physics. He pointed to road networks, river lines, and German rail capacity. He noted that even damaged infrastructure could move forces faster than Allied unloading schedules. He argued that the first week would decide everything, not by heroism, but by flow rates. Eisenhower absorbed these arguments without endorsement. He asked for revised estimates. He requested alternative scenarios. He demanded to know what failure would look like, not success. By February 1944, a pattern had emerged. Plans that assumed rapid momentum collapsed under scrutiny. Plans that allowed for delay survived. The model was changing again, narrowing around endurance rather than speed. This shift placed Eisenhower in an increasingly exposed position. As the plan grew larger and more complex, responsibility concentrated upward. The more voices shaped the design, the fewer could be held accountable if it failed. Eisenhower understood this imbalance. According to later recollections, he accepted it deliberately. In private notes, he began to speak less about winning quickly and more about avoiding catastrophic loss. The distinction was subtle, but decisive. Victory could be delayed. Failure could not be repaired. By March 1944, Eisenhower approved Montgomery's expanded landing plan. The decision was recorded quietly, without announcement. The paperwork treated it as a refinement, not a reversal. But the implications were irreversible. The invasion was now too large to relocate. Too complex to simplify. Too committed to withdraw. Authority had absorbed design. From that point forward, Eisenhower's role changed. Planning gave way to timing. Debate gave way to readiness. The remaining variables were no longer human. They were environmental. The beaches were chosen. The forces were assigned. The assumptions were set. What remained was weather, and the narrow window it allowed. The decision had been made. The clock was now ticking. By April 1944, the invasion plan existed in only one workable form. Its scale could no longer be adjusted without unraveling the entire operation. The landing forces, naval escorts, airborne drops, and follow-on supply schedules were now interdependent. Any change to one component distorted the others. Flexibility had been consumed by preparation. From this point forward, the decisive variable was time. Operation Overlord depended on a narrow convergence of environmental conditions. Tides had to be low enough to expose beach obstacles but rising quickly enough to carry landing craft ashore. Moonlight was required for airborne navigation. Sea states had to permit small craft crossings. Cloud cover had to balance concealment with visibility for air support. These requirements did not align often. According to Allied meteorological analysis, such a window appeared only a few days each month. By early May 1944, the invasion force had begun to assemble in southern England. More than 5,000 vessels crowded ports and anchorages. Over 150,000 troops waited in sealed camps, cut off from outside communication. Vehicles were waterproofed. Maps were issued and collected again. The scale of preparation made concealment impossible. German intelligence noticed. Reconnaissance flights over southern England increased. Signals intercepts recorded heightened radio traffic. Reports from agents, though often unreliable, consistently described unusual concentrations of men and material. German planners interpreted this activity through an assumption already fixed in place. Calais. The Germans understood the Allies were preparing to move. They simply believed they knew where. This belief shaped German reactions to every new signal. When weather delayed Allied movement in early June, it was interpreted as caution rather than constraint. When aerial bombing intensified against rail lines in northern France, it reinforced expectations of a strike near the Straits. Even the absence of activity along the Normandy coast was read as confirmation. A deception that aligned with expectation required no adjustment. By late May, German defensive deployments were effectively frozen. The 15th Army remained positioned opposite Calais. Panzer divisions were held back, awaiting clarity that never arrived. Normandy continued to be treated as a secondary front. On the Allied side, certainty was eroding. Meteorological forecasts deteriorated as June approached. According to records from the Allied meteorological team, early June showed unstable patterns over the Channel, high winds, rough seas, and heavy cloud cover. The planned invasion date of June 5, 1944, began to look untenable. Eisenhower faced a decision that no longer involved strategy, only acceptance of risk. Delay carried its own costs. Troops had been briefed. Embarkation schedules were set. Prolonged waiting increased the chance of compromise. German readiness would only improve. Yet proceeding under poor conditions risked scattering airborne forces, swamping landing craft, and collapsing coordination before the first shot was fired. Staff meetings grew shorter. The same charts were reviewed repeatedly. According to later accounts, Eisenhower listened more than he spoke. The meteorologists disagreed among themselves. Naval commanders warned of losses. Air commanders worried about visibility. There was no correct answer. On June 4, Eisenhower postponed the invasion by 24 hours. The decision bought time but not clarity. The forecast remained marginal. A second delay would push the operation beyond the narrow lunar window, forcing a postponement of weeks. By the early hours of June 5, a brief improvement appeared in the data. Winds were expected to ease slightly. Cloud cover might lift just enough. Seas would remain rough, but manageable. It was not a good forecast. It was the least bad one available. Eisenhower reviewed the information, then dismissed the room. According to staff recollections, he walked alone for several minutes. When he returned, he gave a short instruction. The invasion would go. No speech followed. No justification was offered. Orders moved outward through the chain of command. Transports began loading. Ships weighed anchor. Paratroopers boarded aircraft. The decision closed the final door. At this point, Montgomery's influence ended. His arguments had shaped the scale and structure of the operation, but timing belonged to Eisenhower alone. From this moment forward, success or failure would be attributed upward, not outward. In German headquarters, nothing changed. Weather delays reinforced German confidence that the Allies would wait for ideal conditions. Calais remained the focal point. On June 5, German senior commanders were absent from their posts. Some attended war games. Others traveled inland. No general alert was issued. The model held. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, Allied airborne units crossed the French coast. Naval bombardment followed. Landing craft turned toward beaches that German planners still regarded as unlikely. Normandy was no longer a hypothesis. It was an event. From here on, the war would move in only one direction. The first reports from Normandy did not arrive as conclusions. They arrived as fragments. By dawn on June 6, 1944, Allied airborne units were scattered across the Norman countryside. Some landed near their objectives. Many did not. Drop zones dissolved into hedgerows and flooded fields. Radios failed. Units assembled around whoever they could find. The plan's precision blurred almost immediately. Yet the system did not collapse. Naval gunfire began on schedule. Battleships and cruisers fired by timetable, not confirmation. Landing craft moved despite rough seas. Infantry disembarked under fire that was uneven, localized, and often improvised. German resistance was real, but inconsistent. Strongpoints fought independently. Coordination lagged. By mid-morning the pattern was clear. The German response did not resemble the one the Allies had modeled against. This was the first contradiction. German doctrine assumed immediate counterattack by mobile reserves once the landing point revealed itself. That response did not come. Panzer divisions remained inland. Orders moved slowly. Authority stalled between field commanders, Army Group headquarters, and Berlin. In Normandy, local German units fought with determination, but without reinforcement. According to post-war German records, commanders on the ground requested permission to release armored reserves within hours of the landings. That permission did not arrive. The German assumption that the Normandy landings were a diversion had not yet broken. By the afternoon of June 6, Allied forces were ashore on all 5 beaches. Losses were uneven. Omaha had nearly failed. Utah exceeded expectations. British and Canadian forces advanced cautiously. No decisive breakthrough occurred. But the beaches held. This was the moment the Allied model had been built to survive. The plan had never required immediate success. It required continuity. Supplies had to come ashore. Units had to rotate forward. The lodgement had to widen by degrees rather than leaps. Artificial harbors were assembled offshore. Beach exits were cleared. Engineers worked continuously, often under fire. According to Allied logistical summaries, by the end of the first day, more than 150,000 troops had landed, along with vehicles and artillery that German planners had assumed could not be sustained without a major port. The assumption that Normandy could not support a large force began to erode. German high command now faced a delayed recognition. By the evening of June 6, it was no longer possible to deny that Normandy was a major landing. But the old model still exerted gravity. Calais remained the expected main effort. Normandy was reclassified, not as the invasion, but as the opening phase of it. This distinction mattered. German reinforcements were released incrementally, not decisively. Panzer divisions moved at night, slowed by air attack and damaged rail lines. Command authority fragmented. Rommel, absent during the landings, returned to find a situation already slipping beyond immediate control. The Allied advantage was not momentum. It was time. Each hour the beachhead survived made containment harder. Each day expanded Allied capacity faster than German response. The invasion did not break German defenses. It outlasted them. By June 9, Allied forces had linked beachheads. By June 12, more than 300,000 troops were ashore. The front widened. The lodgement deepened. The artificial harbors functioned long enough to matter. The German model collapsed quietly. Post-war analysis would note that the German response was not slow because of incompetence, but because it was trapped by its own certainty. Commanders acted rationally within an incorrect assumption. Each delay made sense. Together, they proved fatal. For Eisenhower, this phase confirmed the nature of his responsibility. He did not direct the fighting. He did not correct the weather. He did not resolve confusion on the ground. His decision had simply allowed the system to absorb shock without failing. For Montgomery, the expanded front validated his insistence on space. The invasion survived not because it advanced quickly, but because it could not be easily sealed off. By mid-June 1944, the invasion no longer depended on belief. It depended on arithmetic. German losses mounted. Allied strength increased daily. The balance shifted incrementally, then decisively. The question of whether the invasion could be reversed disappeared. From this point on, Germany would fight in France without the option of erasing the landing. The assumption had failed. The model had broken. By mid-June 1944, the invasion had crossed an invisible threshold. It was no longer fragile. It was no longer provisional. The question facing both sides was no longer whether the landings could be undone, but how long the consequences would take to unfold. For the German command, this realization arrived unevenly. On June 14, Hitler authorized the release of additional armored formations toward Normandy. By then, the opportunity for a decisive counterstroke had passed. The delay was not merely operational. It was structural. Authority had been centralized upward so completely that reaction time had become a liability. Decisions moved slower than events. German commanders now fought inside a narrowing space of options. Rail networks were shattered by Allied air power. Movement by day became nearly impossible. Units arrived piecemeal, often under strength, committing themselves to a battle already shaped against them. The Atlantic Wall, once imagined as a fixed barrier, revealed its real function too late. It could slow. It could not decide. For the Allies, the collapse of German assumptions did not produce clarity. It produced obligation. By June 16, Eisenhower's headquarters had begun to receive steady reports of mounting casualties, supply bottlenecks, and stalled advances inland. The hedgerow country of Normandy absorbed momentum. German defensive tactics proved adaptive. Progress was measured in fields, not miles. Yet withdrawal was no longer conceivable. According to post-war accounts, Eisenhower rarely discussed alternatives after June 6. Not because none existed, but because considering them served no purpose. The invasion had passed the point where leadership involved choice. What remained was stewardship. This was the phase Eisenhower had anticipated. Weeks earlier, before the invasion launched, he had written a brief note. It was not intended for public release. It was not motivational. It was procedural. In it, he accepted full responsibility should the invasion fail, attributing no blame to subordinates, no fault to circumstances. He did not revise the note after June 6. That restraint mattered. As the campaign in Normandy dragged on through late June and early July, pressure increased. Allied forces struggled to break out of the lodgment. German resistance stiffened around Caen. American units advanced slowly in the west. Casualties accumulated without dramatic gain. Criticism circulated quietly among commanders. Plans were questioned. Timelines slipped. Expectations adjusted downward. But the central authority did not shift. Eisenhower did not intervene tactically. He did not replace commanders impulsively. He allowed the system to work through friction rather than resetting it under pressure. According to staff recollections, he focused on logistics, reinforcement schedules, and maintaining unity among Allied partners. Montgomery, meanwhile, absorbed criticism for the slow progress in the British sector. His methodical approach appeared cautious to some, stagnant to others. Yet his original logic still held. The front did not collapse. The lodgment expanded gradually. German forces remained fixed, unable to disengage without losing ground. The invasion was now a contest of endurance. By July 1944, Allied strength in Normandy exceeded 1 million men. German forces, constrained by fuel shortages and constant air attack, could not match the buildup. The imbalance became structural. Every German decision was reactive. Every Allied decision compounded advantage. This was not the victory many had imagined. It was not swift. It was not elegant. It was relentless. The responsibility Eisenhower had accepted was no longer hypothetical. It was ongoing. Each delay, each casualty report, each request for additional resources traced upward to a decision already made. There was no moment of vindication, only accumulation. In post-war reflections, historians would note that Eisenhower's greatest act of leadership at Normandy was not choosing the beaches, or approving the weather window, or managing personalities. It was refusing to fracture authority once the cost became visible. Responsibility, once accepted, was not redistributed. By late July, the breakout would finally come. Operation Cobra would rupture German lines in the west. The campaign would accelerate. Paris would fall within weeks. But that outcome lay beyond the invasion itself. What mattered in Normandy was that the war had entered a phase where reversal was no longer a function of decision-making. It was a function of capacity. The final choice had already been absorbed. From this point forward, the war in Western Europe would be fought inside a constraint Germany could no longer escape. By late summer 1944, the question of where the invasion should have landed had disappeared entirely. The Allied armies were advancing across France. Paris was liberated on August 25, 1944. German forces were retreating toward their own borders. The debate that once consumed planners in London and Berlin had been overtaken by events. But the meaning of the decision remained. In post-war analysis, historians often treated the Normandy choice as inevitable in hindsight. Deception plans were emphasized. German errors were catalogued. Whether luck was highlighted. Yet these explanations obscure the more important truth: the invasion succeeded not because the correct location was chosen, but because authority and responsibility were aligned in a way that allowed failure to be absorbed without collapse. Montgomery's role became clearer with distance. He did not choose Normandy. He did not command the invasion politically. What he did was narrow the range of survivable plans. By insisting on breadth, depth, and redundancy, he constrained the operation toward a form that could endure uncertainty. His influence lay not in authorship, but in pressure applied repeatedly until fragile assumptions were discarded. This influence was not universally welcomed. Allied commanders criticized his manner and questioned his caution. Yet the structure he forced into existence proved decisive. The invasion did not depend on rapid success. It depended on remaining intact long enough for arithmetic to assert itself. Eisenhower's role, by contrast, grew heavier as the operation progressed. He did not design the deception plan alone. He did not draft the initial invasion concept. He did not command troops on the beaches. His function was more exposed and less visible. He accepted ownership of an operation whose complexity exceeded any individual's control. The distinction mattered. In centralized systems, authority often seeks control. In Normandy, authority accepted limitation. Eisenhower did not pretend to master every variable. He built a structure resilient enough to function without constant intervention. When the invasion absorbed shock, weather, confusion, resistance, it did not fracture upward. That was not accidental. The contrast with German command culture became unmistakable. German authority concentrated at the top, delayed reaction and constrained initiative. Decisions waited for permission. Assumptions were preserved longer than evidence justified. By the time authority adapted, the environment had already changed. Normandy exposed this difference mercilessly. After the war, German officers repeatedly cited confusion over authority as a central failure. Allied officers, by contrast, described friction, disagreement, and delay, but not paralysis. The Allied system bent. The German system stalled. This was the deeper lesson of the invasion. Wars are not decided solely by plans or brilliance. They are decided by how institutions behave when their models fail. Normandy forced both sides into that test. One system allowed dissent before commitment and unity after decision. The other demanded certainty first and paid for revision later. Eisenhower's pre-written note remains the clearest artifact of that reality. It was not a gesture of humility. It was an acknowledgement of how modern war functioned. Responsibility could not be delegated once consequences began. He understood that leadership at that scale did not mean control over outcomes. It meant ownership of risk. Montgomery's logic shaped the invasion's form. Eisenhower's authority accepted its cost. Between them, the Allied command produced something neither alone could have achieved, a decision that did not require perfection to succeed. Normandy did not hinge on brilliance. It hinged on endurance. And endurance, in the end, was not a matter of courage or speed, but of structure. That is what the invasion revealed. And that is why the decision still matters. If you've made it this far, you understand that history isn't decided in a single moment. It's shaped by timing, hesitation, and the decisions people make when options begin to close. If this perspective speaks to you, consider subscribing for future episodes. As the war itself would prove, once events are set in motion, they rarely wait for permission.